this is the sort of thing that will rattle the Kremlin, because even the Kremlin can't keep the war machine going without money. And despite the fact that gold has now pushed through $5,000 an ounce, and the Russians, have a bit of gold, it's not going to last forever. And, they absolutely need it.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 1435 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking once again to an old friend of the show, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Now, Hamish, Director of Doctors Under Fire, former British Army Colonel, CBRN and biosecurity expert, author of Chemical Warrior, and soon-to-be published Tank Commander, which is something that we strongly recommend that people get, because armoured vehicles and everything else is something people need to have this understanding of. But you're an old friend of Frontline. Hamish, welcome back.
Well, Philip, thanks very much for having me, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Well, and a Happy New Year to you. I don't think I've seen you since last year, and there's nothing to really happen. So it's gone very quick. No, there's so much has happened in this 1 month. It's frightening. And one of the things, just to start off with this, we've had Davos that's occurred, and last Thursday, President Zelensky of Ukraine, who hadn't planned to be there until Donald Trump said he's meeting President Zelensky, and I think he jumped very quickly on an aircraft and flew over, in a speech to Davos, quoted Groundhog Day. And that, for those who don't know, is where Bill Murray played a cynical journalist caught in a time loop, reliving the same day over and over again. But Zelensky said just last year here in Davos, I ended my speech with the words, "Europe needs to know how to defend itself." He then went on to say, a year has passed and nothing has changed. We're still in a situation where I must say the same words again. Is Europe in Groundhog Day? Is he right?
Well, I think, Zelensky is right when he talks about Groundhog Day. I think, first of all, looking at Ukraine itself and the situation on the ground there, Philip, 12 months ago, we were waiting for President Trump to start, get stuck into his second term. And of course, he'd come in with the words he was going to sort Ukraine out in 24 hours. Well, 12 months later, we are still at Groundhog Day, because, we probably had a similar talk 12 months ago, and we are still talking about almost exactly the same things. I think when it comes on to Europe, I think Zelensky's great frustration coming from him there. Again, he was saying the same things. In the last 12 months, European countries have announced that they are, building up their militaries again, building up their arms, spending more money on it. The UK itself, although with, you and I both know when it comes to politicians say they're going to spend a lot of more money, one is always a bit circumspect taking that as gospel, because that's not always the case. But I think when it comes to support to Ukraine, then, I think Zelensky's got a real point there. Certainly, equipment and advice has kept flowing through, but Trump has turned on and off US support, as though he's turning on and off the shower sort of thing. It's been incredibly regular, and it's been disjointed and really not helping. And when it comes on to the peace process that we'll talk about in a minute, are we any further forward today than we were 12 months ago? So I think Zelensky's great frustration, and the final bit on this, the Institute for War issued some notes, I think this week or maybe at the end of last week, really talking about how much land had changed hands in the last 12 months. And in fact, they're saying in the last 24 months, 2 years, Russia has gained just over 1%, 1.4% of Ukraine territory. Their rate of advance in that period has been 17 meters per day. This is, in the First World War, the Battle of Cambrai, if you made 17 meters, or maybe Passchendaele, not Cambrai, then that was quite a good effort. So, what's happening is very, very little. So I think what Zelensky is saying is absolutely right. And I think his frustration at Davos and his frustration since, because, we haven't seen much talk coming out of the White House from Davos about Ukraine in the last few days, last week or so. So, Groundhog Day, I think, is a pretty good description.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You talk about the ground that's been captured and held. In the same length of time, because it's almost exactly the same length of time. Russia pushed the Germans back from just outside Moscow to just outside Berlin. And for those that are listening, I've said this a few times now. Whereas in the last 4 years, coming up to the start of the fifth year, the Russians have only advanced about 40 to 50 kilometers in total. And actually, if you put it into context, in the first 2 years, they lost tens of thousands of square kilometers that they had initially captured and were pushed back into the east. And the east hasn't really moved much over the I was going to say 12 months, but as you rightly said, the last 24 months. And at the moment, we're seeing the Russians claiming some very small tactical successes in the Zaporizhia oblast, which is just to the southeast of where Pokrovsk is, where we've been focusing on for the last year, but they haven't even captured Pokrovsk yet, and I thought that would fall before Christmas. Do you think that we're actually in a stalemate situation at the moment, or which side's got the initiative?
Well, I think, again, a lot of smoke and mirrors, Philip. And as you say, not much has happened in the last 12 or 24 months. Now, Russia has put a lot of disinformation and propaganda effort around Petrovsk in the last few months or so, saying how much effort they were putting in. They were allegedly getting a force together of 100,000, plus armor, etc., to take Petrovsk, and they just haven't done it. And in fact, over the last few weeks, I think the head of Ukraine military was talking to the Kyiv Independent over the weekend, really saying what they've been doing in that area. And Ukraine forces very effectively infiltrating into areas where Russia has taken them and taking back ground. And in that very same area, Russia is still losing 1,000 men a day. Completely unsustainable, you would have thought, but talks more about how they're getting sort of mercenaries and people to the front line. But basically, the contact line, the front lines, the trenches have moved virtually nowhere, certainly in the last few months, and probably in the last sort of 24 months. And I think that is a frustration that we all have, and Zelensky has, that Putin is trying to suggest that Trump and everybody else that he's about to break through and take the whole country. Nothing could be further from the truth, I don't think. And that's, again, the frustration that actually, if it would appear that Ukraine would now settle on a ceasefire and a peace line on current, where the forces are currently aligned, which, seem pretty unfair to the Ukrainians, but if they're prepared to do that, then if Trump really forced the issue here, you would have thought that they could make progress. But again, more frustration. He's looking the other way at the moment.
But then, is it Trump that's not forcing the issue, or is it Putin that's just refusing to accept it? Because Putin's line hasn't changed one jot, and then behind closed doors, that's probably what he's saying to Steve Witkoff, and what Witkoff is then saying to Trump. There's no point in trying to suggest freezing on current lines, because that is just unacceptable. Putin still thinks he can win the tactical battle.
Oh, entirely, Philip. I mean, absolutely. And we've been discussing this for years now. And as you say, Putin's position has not changed 1 inch at all. All the talk and the hyperbole coming out of Washington and elsewhere, at the end of the day, Putin is sitting there like some Cheshire cat, stroking Trump and making absolutely no concessions at all. And, he thinks he can sit it out. We've talked about Europe being a Groundhog Day. Putin just doesn't think Europe has got the stomach for this particular fight. And he's pretty sure if he can string Trump along a bit longer, Trump certainly hasn't got the stomach for the fight. So, yeah, I suppose, you with your intelligence background and, your negotiation interrogation type experience would say he's playing the perfect game and absolutely wrapping everybody else around his fingers, because he ain't moved a single inch.
Oh, you can see the old KGB playbook coming out every time, and it's classic It is classic KGB playbook. Now, but before we get into the implications of what's going on with Putin and Trump and all the rest of that higher level, I want to come back to more the tactical level and some of the lessons learned that are coming out. We've seen the real change that there has been in the way the battle space has been fought over with unmanned aerial vehicles. And then we've seen the way the naval environment has been affected by autonomous naval vehicles and Ukraine effectively dominating the Black Sea, even though Ukraine doesn't have a navy, and the Black Sea fleet has been effectively decimated. It's almost culminated, I think. But and those have had a massive impact on the conflict so far. But we're now getting reports of unmanned ground vehicles doing things that are not the sort of thing that we'd have expected before. We've seen them in Northern Ireland clearing barriers and used in areas where there's high risk from improvised explosive devices. The Ukrainians are using them to clear minefields and all the rest of it. But the thing that really struck me was a report of an unmanned ground vehicle actually holding ground. What do you think are the tactical consequences for this in the future battlefield? And I note that you've just written an absolutely fantastic article that's looked at the lessons that the British Army should be pulling out of what's going on in Ukraine. And how that needs actually money to be put to it instead of just the rhetoric that we're getting.
Yeah, I mean, the autonomous vehicles this is what is really coming out of the war in Ukraine. I don't, people are saying it's changing the way we fight. Well, it's not. It's not changing the principles of war. It's not changing the way we fight. We're just fighting at extension. Having these autonomous vehicles actually conducting the awful bits on the ground that hitherto soldiers or sailors would be doing. And certainly when you and I discussed with our naval friends that perhaps the way forward is autonomous maritime ships, there is a real wobbly lip along those who live in Portsmouth and Plymouth, but there is a sort of point to this. And then when you come on to the ground and land environment, we are on the Ukraine the latest podcast recently. We were talking about how an autonomous ambulance had gone into no man's land and rescued a soldier who'd been there for weeks, and then got him back. I mean, this is something. And my piece that I, after my visit to the Land Warfare Centre, talking about the lessons. I want to reassure people. I think at the lowest tactical levels, we are absolutely getting them. And of course, we've discussed before the fact that under Operation Interflex, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are trained in the UK. And of course, we're learning an awful lot from them as well. And I think that has been replicated now, basic training for soldiers. I know it's been replicated at Sandhurst, I'm sure across all three services. But the autonomy is absolutely fascinating. And when you have, as you say, autonomous vehicles, with varying degrees of armament, them actually holding ground, in effect, the person controlling them is seeing that ground through some sort of screen. So it is just different. It means that there's not flesh and bones actually there doing this. But I think that where it goes. But what did struck me about being with the Land Warfare Centre, and also the things that you and I have been looking at, is it's the threat paradigm, isn't it? It's the threat dynamic. The FPV drones of 2.5 years ago are not having nearly the effect they are today as they were then, because we've learned to counter drones, whether it being putting cages on tanks or whether it being producing some sort of hard kill or another drone to take out another drone. So these things, and myself looking at Challenger 3, and which is the new British tank, and Ajax, the recce vehicle. These things are getting what we call hard kill defensive aid suites, where a year ago we were talking about how could a tank survive when it's been attacked by 10 drones. Well, it survives by being able to take those drones at the flick of a switch, which we are sort of almost there. So then you get autonomous drones that actually have fiber optic cables, so they're not quite as autonomous as they were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the autonomy is certainly the talk, something we have to master. and get on with. But the point of my piece, and as you said, this all costs a heck of a lot of money. You cannot do it on the cheap. And if we are going to make sure that the British Army, the British forces are really fit for the 21st century and fit for the current and future battlefields, we have got to invest in them and got to invest a heck of a lot more than we are at the moment, because otherwise we're going to produce capability that might look jolly nice on the parade ground, but when it meets with the enemy. But I am reassured by spending a couple of days at the Land Warfare Centre that actually at the lowest tactical levels we are really getting this. And my spy at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst tells me there are drones all over their exercises, and they are learning this stuff at the lower tactical levels. Of course, are we learning it? Are we doing this at the operational level and the levels beyond sort of troop and platoon? I suppose that is a real question that I don't have an answer for at the moment.
Well, yeah, that's the difficulty. That's where the dinosaurs like us, and when you get to the senior levels, are going, what is this touchscreen thing? What's an app? Where's my piece of paper and everything else? The difficulty we have. But is this just another example of an additional layer of complexity coming into modern warfare, in the same way that every time we've gone through a major conflict, there have been new layers of complexity that have come in. If we look at the transition from horses to motor transport, and then motor transport to armored motor transport, and then you get tanks on the battlefield, and then you get aircraft coming in and bringing that in, having to work it, and then you get different artillery and different rockets, and then you get guidance systems that are coming in, and each time there's a conflict, there's another layer that comes in, and therefore it reinforces the importance of having a professional military that can understand this and bring all of this complexity together to have an effect. And it's going to make a professional military that can do that much more capable against something that is a ragtag put together, or you purely or heavily conscripted military that doesn't have time to get that complexity right.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. In fact, two great points you make there, Phil. First of all, the complexity that you're talking about, that is being enabled by AI. And I'm absolutely staggered how that is the case. And you as an intelligence officer, what sort of intelligence that we work with in Afghanistan and Iraq was one thing. But now that you look at everything else, to try and do it in the sort of mandrolic ways we used to do it, you would have been completely snowed under. But now the way that AI is being used to filter out the wheat from the chaff is crucial. But I think the really important point you make is about professionalism and the ragtag army. And we're seeing that in Ukraine. We're seeing that with the Russians. So quite apart from building the intelligence picture that you're so used to, it's also about building, the combined arms maneuver stuff that is really my domain. Now, in order to be able to operate, particularly in this environment with drones and everything else, you've got to be really slick. And, when I was training up the 1st Royal Tank Regiment to do this stuff, it took about a year or two. Now, the Russians are putting people into the front line with days or weeks training. So there is no way they can get around it. And I expect, although they might have some specialists and all the rest of it, the sophistication of the sort of, intelligence networks that we're looking at now to provide that actionable intelligence that you need to be able to attack how you want, it is just not there. So it is, I think, although we talk about the British military being so small and all the rest of it these days, if it is funded properly and equipped properly and trained properly, it will have the ability to make a demonstrative impact. I also talk in my piece in the Telegraph about, mass is something that is really important still, but it's, we've got to think in the 21st century. A mass of tanks doesn't necessarily mean 1,000 tanks. To me, it means a couple of hundred tanks that can operate really smartly and have an effect with all the other bits and pieces involved. So, yeah, the more professional I think the military you have, the more, it sounds obvious, the more effective it will be. And that's why I'm frustrated with Zelensky and others that, in fact, although there's a mass of Russians there, they are not effective because they can do little more than walk in a straight line and fire a rifle, which, although we are fighting trench warfare, that might have been effective in the First World War, but crikey, it shouldn't be effective now.
Well, yes, but in saying that, we saw in the Falklands War British troops having to fix bayonets and attack with bayonets, and we saw the same in Iraq as well, which people don't realise. They think it's all pushing buttons and everything else, but we haven't got there. But you're jumping up now from this very tactical level up into the strategic bits. 2026 so far has been a year of turmoil, but it's not turmoil being caused necessarily by China or Russia or anything else. It's turmoil being caused by allies going and talking about things and creating problems where nobody expected there to be problems. And in particular, President Trump with his piece on Greenland, and you're once again blaming Zelensky for starting the war and everything else. You're looking at that. What do you think Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are making of this? And do you think that this turmoil is actually emboldening Putin in a way that he's just sitting back further, and it's making him just want to elongate the conflict in Ukraine and not go down a peace plan?
Oh, entirely. I think Putin must be sat back in the Kremlin, stroking his white cat with a big grin on his face. He almost, if he was orchestrating Trump, would he do it any differently? When we had a bit of, the Trump operation to lift Maduro out of Venezuela, actually, one sort of thought, crikey, that's probably quite a good move if you can follow it up. But was it done for the right reasons or not? I'm not sure. We shall see. But the Greenland issue, I think, that was a banana skin of global size. Without rehearsing all the details again, but to try and take a NATO country that was defending him anyway, would seem to be absolutely bonkers when you should have been we hoped to be focusing on actually trying to create a peace in Europe. So I think when it comes to Putin, he is delighted, and each time Witkoff and Kushner go and see him, no doubt he's pilfering their mobile phones anyway, and sending back a message, that Trump's happy to take, but do nothing about. When it comes to Xi Jinping, and of course Starmer is there at the moment, what on earth the Chinese are up to? I think not that I know very much about China, and I'm no expert there, so I'm purely as a sort of off the cuff commentator. But again, I think the Chinese are delighted as well, because they're linked into everybody. And it seems to me, quite frankly, they don't care as long as they get, paid and we buy their kit. We understand that the Chinese are helping the Russians with a whole host of things at the moment, from missile technology to high-end electronics. No doubt, which is strange, because I don't suppose at the moment Putin's paying very much for that. And I'm sure that is the approach to Beijing, and hopefully Starmer at least will be doing that to make sure that actually the Chinese realise that the root of their economic development and mastery comes from the West, and not Russia and the East. So yeah, I think at the moment, us in Europe, and most especially Ukraine, are very much in the middle, and unfortunately, all the hits are hitting Ukraine and Europe, and the three leaders, Ping, Putin, and Trump, are sort of playing some very odd, strategic game that it's very difficult to unpick and very difficult to know what they're going to do next, especially Trump.
Well, I was heartened to hear that the Prime Minister's team took burner laptops and telephones in with them, and took a burner aircraft with them. They didn't want the RAF Boris Force One because of the danger of it getting bugged in different places. So they've hired one to go in, recognizing the real threat that there is from China. Oh, just as they approved the mega embassy in London, but that's a different story completely. But you mentioned the hiatus from Trump, and you talked about his arrest of Maduro in Venezuela. We've also seen the Americans board and arrest a Grey Fleet ship under Russian flag in the middle of the Atlantic. We've seen the French now do the same in the Mediterranean. And only in the last 48 hours, we've seen most European NATO nations and the United Kingdom sign a letter effectively turning around saying that any ship or any vessel that changes its flag, changes its name, turns its AIS off, that's its navigation beacon off in the Baltic Sea, will be considered a flagless ship and therefore subject to boarding and arrest under international law. Do you think this is the European elements of NATO now finally standing up? And do you think Putin's going to get worried?
Well, yeah, at last, why didn't we do this 2 or 3 years ago? Because we all know that Putin is reliant on his oil for the currency to keep the war machine running, and we seem to have known that these ships have been doing that. So I think, yeah, absolutely, and by all accounts, yeah, this is the sort of thing that will rattle the Kremlin, because even the Kremlin can't keep the war machine going without money. And despite the fact that gold has now pushed through $5,000 an ounce, and the Russians, have a bit of gold, it's not going to last forever, and they absolutely need it. So I think it is, and quite apart from shipping dodgy oil around the world, what else are these ships doing as well? I think we've talked before about some of the known Russian spy ships surveying around the British Isles for cables and all the rest of it. You would know better than I, but I wouldn't be at all surprised that a lot of these ships, carry a couple of our KGB muckers and some of their kit on it as well. Or FSB even, or GRU. But so I think it is a good move, and it's if you like, this is grey zone activity from our side. Let's not forget, no doubt the Russians are doing exactly the same. We discussed, I think, before Christmas about how MI6 and GCHQ were telling us about the hybrid war we were involved in, and this is part of this. This is what happens in this sort of interwar period. And are we now on the front foot? Let's hope so, because I think it will have an impact more than a lot of other stuff, and perhaps more than some of the other kinetic activity that people would like to have on the Russians, that actually at this stage European NATO countries just can't risk doing.
Yeah, well, and it's a very cost-effective way of supporting Ukraine without having to send them weapons and everything else and have a great effect. But on that slightly positive note, let's hope we see this. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Frontline.
Great, thanks very much for having me, Phil. Always good to be on Frontline.
And you're one thing, you're one of the first to know this. For those that are watching, thank you for watching. But Frontline has been so successful. Actually, we're moving to our own channel, and that's in the process of migrating across and all the content in there. But people can still catch us on Times Radio between at 01:35 hours Greenwich Mean Time, or if you're in the United States, 20:35 Eastern Standard Time. And they can also get us on their favorite podcast channel by just searching for Frontline. But Hamish, once again, thank you for being a guest today.
Thank you.